Welcome to Inside Academia, the weekly program where we take a look behind the ivory curtain seeking a frank discussion of American education. I'm your host, Andy Nash. My guest this week is Mr. Jim Wolfston. He is President and CEO of CollegeNET. It's a company providing 1,300 colleges and universities with scheduling and admissions servicing. They also provide a scholarship site for college students on CollegeNET.com. Mr. Jim Wolfston, welcome to Inside Academia.
Well, Andy, thanks for having me.
First, tell us a little bit about what CollegeNET does for universities and colleges.
Well, CollegeNET is the leading provider of what's called software as a service applications for universities. We process admissions applications for over 600 institutions, including Princeton Graduate School, University of Michigan, MIT, Stanford, all of the University of Washington. When a student applies to one of these institutions, it looks to them that they're using forms that are hosted, for example, by Ohio State, but in fact they're physically served by our computers on behalf of the institution. We provide back-end servicing so that the institution can communicate effectively with the applicants. We also do faculty evaluation. So again, if a student evaluates faculty at Princeton, they're doing so through forms that look like Princeton, but in fact they're served by our computers on behalf of the institution. So these are some of the services that we provide to institutions, and we have over 1,300 university clients.
Okay, so presumably this, I guess, saves colleges and universities money from otherwise having to come up with these platforms on their own?
Yes, there's a lot of cost, obviously, with respect to any innovation, and anything with respect to the web is moving very quickly. But there's also the burden increasing on the university of hosting applications on behalf of students. Bandwidth requirements are going up, and no benefactor wants to put his or her name on a computer center. They want to put it on the liberal arts department or on the business school. So there's a dearth of funding for this increasing cost center for the institution, and that is information technology. So there's a real movement in the university space towards software as a service, which basically means that the institution is able to use the application capability without installing and upgrading the software and hosting it on their own computer servers.
Any of these schools that have these big IT programs, you would think that they would have all these young, innovative minds, and they're making all these discoveries and research that somebody would program something like that, and then they would create that, as opposed to sourcing it out, I thought.
Sure, and that often happens where the institution will, for example, come up with its own admissions application, but then what happens when the kid graduates? Who maintains it? And further, what happens when the university needs to compete? For example, one of the things that we introduced in our admissions application services is the capacity of the institution to have a video. In other words, the student can respond to questions via video. He or she can respond almost as if it's an interview, except it's on the web. Well, that's an example of innovation that CollegeNET, because we're focused on this particular sphere, can press forward on, and the institution, if they don't take advantage of our services, loses out on that cutting-edge capability.
If they're going to cut costs by shopping out services like this to companies such as yourself, why is tuition still necessarily keeps skyrocketing? The student doesn't seem to feel the cost savings on his or her own pocketbook. And so that brings me to the Wall Street Journal piece that you had back on, I believe it was July 6th, in which you actually questioned, is higher education worth the money? And you laid out some statistics in which you mentioned that it seems as though the often quoted number of a college graduate earning about $1 million more over a lifetime than a high school grad. But the question is, are all the students that are paying the high cost of tuition getting that type of return that the colleges and the promoters of college are averaging out? And that's why I come back to you with your column. You conclude by saying that students should make that cost-benefit analysis up front, but the question is, in a society and in a world where we're constantly telling people, everybody, you have to go to college, you have to go, how many people are necessarily making that cost-benefit to figure out if, in fact, college is right for them?
Right. We see a circumstance where, because of innovation and change, it's necessary to get more and more educated in order to participate in what amounts to a knowledge economy, even a learning economy. It isn't even so much important what you think you know, it's how much capacity you have to learn because it's changing so quickly. Think about the fact that 15 years ago, people didn't even understand what the internet or the web happened to be, but now it's ubiquitous, it's critical, it's part of the interview that we're having right now. So that change that we're seeing in the world requires more and more capability to learn, to master the craft of understanding every day, the ability to encounter new information, to digest it, to map to it through metaphor, to exercise skill, and to participate in this learning economy. It's difficult in any kind of quote-unquote cost-benefit analysis, because it is true that as many students as possible who can access the capability of honing their learning skills, that's better for them, it's better for our society. But the big dilemma that you pointed out is the cost. We have a circumstance, Wall Street Journal just published last week, the fact that median income for a family of 4 is now at 1996 levels. So effectively over the past 15 years, we've made no progress. But yet tuition has skyrocketed during that time. So the ability of the family of 4 to afford a higher education is increasingly being strained by this tuition gap. While CollegeNet's doing its part with regards to innovating in the software as a service mode, that is just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle, which includes depressed funding from both federal and state sources for higher education, skyrocketing salaries of administrators, a sort of arms race between institutions to compete for so-called prestige with U.S. News & World Report rankings, where those rankings quite often don't measure what's really important. And what's important historically in education is preparing individuals not just through their skills, but also their ethos to contributing to the world, contributing to the future. And those things are difficult to measure and hence can't sell magazines. But you can sell magazines on things like SAT scores or square footage of gym space or how many donors contribute to an institution, none of which necessarily bears on this question of whether this individual who's being educated will contribute to solving problems in our world. Thanks for noticing and commenting on my article in the Wall Street Journal. It's a great topic.
It used to be that the prestige of a university came largely from that sort of human ethos that you mentioned, rather than how big the gym is or how big the facilities are or how many physical resources a facility has in terms of computer labs and recreation and so on and so forth. Today, in our highly consumer-driven approach to higher education, we seem to be driving prestige of universities based on those physical, tangible resources that are produced and consumed. I don't know if you see it the same way, and if so, the question becomes then, with the escalating costs, haven't we sort of in essence betrayed the very idea of what made colleges and universities so coveted in the first place?
Well, I agree. I agree that we're in a drift and it needs to change. We have a circumstance where prestige is used as a kind of marketing tool, that such and such institution is prestigious. Well, if it's prestigious, what's the support for that? And the support for that typically is something that's already occurred, something that's in the past. Well, what's in the past is obviously important, but it's not what necessarily is going to drive the future. And what is going to drive the future is people's dedication to addressing the problems, the new and interesting problems that we're leaving behind for this next generation. So how the university inspires people to care, that's where, in my view, prestige ought to derive from. It's where students ought to be aimed to achieve, develop the skills, develop the liberal education, develop the capacity to speak, to write, to compute, develop these things for a purpose, the purpose being to create a better world for our children. Of course, that's a big question as well. What is better? What is good? And those are questions that universities, unfortunately, have largely punted on. It used to be the case that institutions were tied up with religious questions. The Harvard School of Divinity, the Yale School of Divinity, these are the roots of these great institutions. Well, the institutions have drifted to the point where, for example, prior to the Great Recession in 2008, half of the students at Harvard University had declared finance as a major and were asking Larry Summers, the then president, for his signature on dollar bills. And this shouldn't be a finance university. This ought to be a university. And a university deals with a whole totality of problems and capabilities and knowledge sets for a purpose. And that purpose, as you alluded to, in many respects has gone by the wayside. I think we've lost our way from the time of Francis Bacon, who really set in motion the modern university. back in the 16th and 17th century, when he declared that we needed to craft the university environment in such a way that students and faculty acted not as ants collecting information, collecting degrees, collecting knowledge, but as honeybees, collecting pollen for the sake of nectar to create honey for things that were sweet and useful to human life. That was Bacon's dictum. He looked at what happened in China. He looked at the fact that the institutions in Britain at the time were largely concerned with theologic questions, but it was China that was producing the things that were changing the world. China was producing gunpowder. China was producing printing. China was producing the compass. And these real-world innovations that were making a difference in human life is what Francis Bacon tried to steer the university towards. And I think for a long time that ethos existed and persisted in the university, but as you said, we've gotten education to the point where it's devolved to a kind of consumer purchase. It's a decal on the back of a windshield. It's something to talk about at the cocktail party about how many schools Johnny was admitted to or offered admission to, as opposed to a place that challenges the next set of minds to solve these problems in the world that we're leaving behind for them, asking them about their purpose in innovating a better world. That's the mandate that Bacon set forth that we need to return to, in my opinion.
We see with Arm and Rox's book, Academically Adrift, that many students are not developing the critical thinking skills, neither in the humanities or in the analytical logic that you would get from the social sciences, nor in any kind of a vo-tech or empirical hands-on science and research and development kind of way, so as to bring about those innovative changes and new developments that are going to be useful for mankind. So if that's the case, and so many people are just necessarily becoming just credentialed, and this is where I want to tie back into your company for a moment. If, let's say, a young person is coming to apply to work at CollegeNET to become a software developer, right, or any kind of a useful but innovative and dynamic person that's going to come up with new ideas that you're going to be able to use and sell to, say, universities. Does your company, for example, look at that college degree to weed out all the applicants, or do you have some other sort of way by which determining, does this person in fact have that dynamic, sort of ingenious and innovative type of mentality, regardless if they went to college or not? Because many people aren't getting that from colleges, but they may be getting them from their own combination of experiences that are taking place outside of the universities.
Right. Well, I think it's a good question, and it's a question that we have to deal with every day. It is, again, a kind of prediction of the future when you sit down with an interviewee as to whether or not he or she will be fecund and productive in this particular environment. Of course, the education's a critical factor for us because, after all, the students are dealing with software and services that are being placed into institutions of higher learning. But it's also a very important question and part of our interviewing process to ensure that that individual has a bigger scope, not just this byte or that bit or this language or that language, but again, back to the purpose. We have to make disciplined choices with regards to the work that we do in higher education. If you think about it, we're a kind of electronic post office between applicants and the institution, and so that carries with it a lot of responsibility. You and I can be pretty sure that if I send a Federal Express envelope to you, it doesn't get opened and the information purloined for some kind of marketing purpose. But unfortunately, we've seen exactly that sort of thing happen with respect to admissions application processing. It's a kind of Wild West out there, and there have been some cases where vendors expediently have decided, well, let's do more than charge the institution. Let's siphon off the data to sell to banks, student lenders, and others. So one of the things that CollegeNet tests for is the capacity of the individual to think beyond the bits and the bytes to the purpose. What's the purpose? We have an important purpose here. We're becoming part of the circulatory system, the information circulatory system of an institution by virtue of this software as a service method, this software as a service modality. So we all have to make choices, disciplined choices about how that gets laid out, because after all, the university is the conduit, the nexus between our generation and the next, and a big important task here is the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, the transmission of values from one generation to the next. Well, that can be obviated if the institution is basically being exploited for some kind of marketing or consumer gimmick. And so something like faculty evaluation, something like admissions application processing, even something like scheduling, these are important things that ought to be serviced in a manner that is true to the clear and obvious purpose and not to some kind of third-party marketing scam. And so CollegeNet has to maintain discipline. We have to have people here who think that way.
Your non-corporate site offers a scholarship program for students at www.collegenet.com. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that was an innovation that came from the fact that we decided to provide a scholarship ourselves for students who were applying to college via the web. About 10 years ago, we thought, well, we have enough students who are doing this. Let's ask the institutions to nominate a handful of students for a scholarship. And we would cite the topic, and we would evaluate, like a bunch of graybeards sitting around a table, which essay was the best. Well, it turned out to be time-consuming, and we were looking for a way to innovate around that. We thought, well, isn't it possible to give that decision-making capacity to the students? Because after all, these students who are filling out this essay are not really learning from each other. They submit their essay on the topic that we cite, and they put it off into the black hole, and some weeks later they either win something or they don't. Well, is there a way to innovate so that students can cite the topic, and that students can evaluate which topics are interesting, and students can further see the work of other students and learn from it? Hence CollegeNet.com. So instead of putting the money out there in a traditional manner where we make the decisions, we put it out there on a weekly basis for the students to make the decisions. And so it helps the students. It doesn't matter where they happen to be in their academic career. All of us have to have the capacity to come up with topics and ideas that are of interest to other individuals. We need to be able to opine. We need to be able to speak about those things. We need to be able to write about those things. We've also introduced videos, so people like you and I now have to exchange information in front of the camera to be able to explain their point of view. So it's turned out to be a very interesting experiment. It's saved us the headache as a company of having to award these scholarships and turn that decision-making capability over to the students. And all the while they have the opportunity to hone these skills, the skills, again, of citing a topic that's of interest, opining on that topic, much like you do as a journalist, much like I do as a corporate executive.
I want to thank you here for joining us again today. Jim Wolfston, CEO of CollegeNet.com. It's been a real privilege speaking with you today.
Likewise, Andy. Thanks for having me on your program.
All right, I'm Andy Nash. This has been InsideAcademia.tv. Please join us again next week, as every week, as we take you for a look behind the ivory curtain.